Hi, this is Bill McCamley, and welcome to What the Bleep Does This Mean? A podcast where we try to explain a complicated thing happening in the public in 15 minutes or less and in language you can hopefully understand. Coming to you today from amazingly sunny Ireland, where I'm visiting some friends for St. Patrick's Day. But today, let's talk about public schools. As we see, national Republicans are looking to get rid of the federal Department of Education. And states like Texas are really trying to replace traditional public school funding with a voucher program. So it's really important we all know the reason we have public schools, the value they add to our communities, and what efforts to change them now mean. So, what was the inspiration for schools here in the States? Well, it started in Puritan New England. These folks were hardcore Protestants, the original colonists, and they believed strongly that everyone had the ability to talk to God directly. Well, if you believe this, and the Bible is what you are using as a common message for your shared religion, everyone kind of has to be able to read to make that work. So, one of the first things leaders did in the early 1630s was establish schools. And this became common throughout the northern colonial region. In fact, in New England, they had some of the highest literacy rates in the world at the time, with Dedham, Massachusetts establishing the first taxpayer funded school in 1644. 3 years later, the Massachusetts legislature passed something called the Old Deluder Act, which required towns with 50 or more families to establish a public school so that people could read and therefore not be kept by Satan, the old deluder, from reading the Bible. This was a very regional thing in the early United States. In the southern colonies, governments actually went in the other direction and passed laws specifically forbidding slaves to learn how to read or write. It started in 1739 in South Carolina. And the reason was that white owners didn't want black slaves to be able to forge documents showing they were free if they were to escape. But the concept in the North was set. And in the 1800s, a guy named Horace Mann, who was the secretary of the Massachusetts Board of Education, set up a standardized system for public schools in the state, including curricula and grading. He also set up normal schools to train teachers in the new system. And his argument to the business folks, which still holds true today, was that a more educated populace meant better workers and therefore more profit potential. That system was widely copied in the northern states, with southern states generally far behind. After the Civil War, though, the US government established the Office of Education, which was set up because they wanted to make sure there was a central place where all information regarding state education issues could be analyzed to see what was working and what was not, with a specific intent to look at the Southern schools as there was a worry, which was real, that equal rights for all students would not happen. That office later became the US Department of Education in the 1970s. But by 1870, we were moving forward. All states had at least some free elementary schools, and by 1917, every state, the last being Mississippi, made school attendance compulsory. Since then, you've had a general evolution of schools, including the establishment of elementary, middle, or junior high schools and high schools set up in the 30s, the first subsidized school lunch programs in the 40s to make sure kids had something in their bellies when they were learning, integration of schools in the 1950s after the famous Brown versus the Board of Education decision. And then you had federal funding increase in the 60s with a program called Title I and the No Child Left Behind program in the early 2000s, which said, yeah, we'll give you more funding states if you put more standardized testing into place. So where are we at now? Well, education remains one of the biggest hot button issues in states and communities across the country. Just a few years ago, I was a representative in New Mexico, and public schools were the biggest by far part of the state budget, with education issues remaining some of the most intense things debated. And public opinion on schools is actually kind of interesting. First off, education issues were the second highest concern among parents in the last election, only trailing the economy. Overall, Americans aren't feeling super great about the direction of public education as a whole today. The latest poll showing that about 55% of Americans are not satisfied with K-12 education. Only 43% were satisfied, but that number is rebounding from a low of 36% a couple of years ago as COVID issues were really catching up with schools. Positively, though, parents really trust teachers. The vast majority of folks saying that they trust their local teachers and their local school districts, 88% of them, a lot more than they do their state or federal government when talking about school policy. But one of the things this overall worry about schools has engendered is called school choice. Before we go on, this can mean a lot of things. It can mean you can choose the public school in your community you choose to send your kids to. It can mean having charter school options, or it can mean a state-supported college savings account, which is really popular. However, when many right-wing politicians talk about school choice, know that this is a code word for school vouchers. And it is really important that we define exactly what this is. There was this economist in the 1950s named Milton Friedman. The guy hated government and wanted America to be dominated by capitalism. So instead of having the government spend money directly on schools, he proposed having vouchers for education. And that theory is actually pretty simple. Instead of having large budgets that set up public schools, states would just give families a set check that could only be used for education. Friedman wanted all schools to be private businesses that would then compete to be good in order to win more kids to the schools and therefore make more money. And if there's one thing Americans love, it is having a choice. So the idea has caught on and actually been implemented in Arizona and Florida. What has happened in these states? The biggest issue is that it is really, really expansive. First, let's go to Florida. They've had voucher programs for a while, but in 2023, they opened it up for everyone in their state, not just low-income families. The result is a total cost of about $4 billion in the coming school year, a lot more expensive than the old model where money just went for public schools. The reason? Well, it costs the state about $4,500 per student to fund a kid in public school. The rest is funded by local taxes. But if you're in a voucher program, you can get about $8,800 or almost double that amount. Now we go to Arizona. Their voucher program, which was estimated to only cost $65 million per year, actually costs the state over $400 million per year. And it is one of the biggest issues where for the reason they're having a shortfall in their overall state budget, which means they're having to cut some other things. And in Arizona, you can basically get the same amount as in Florida, between $7,000 and $8,000 per student per year. The interesting thing about both these states is that the vast majority of people still choose, if that's the word we want to use, to send their kids to regular public schools. About 87% in Florida and 90% in Arizona. The main reason being, private schools are really fucking expensive. The average price of a private high school in the US is around $16,000. And that does not include money for things like uniforms, technology, books, and other fees they might charge. So if you get 8K from the state and you can't come up with the other 8 grand in addition to the other fees, then you simply will not be able to afford the tuition and keep your kids in public schools. The main expense of vouchers is giving money to rich people who were already able to afford the tuition at a private school. You get a few families where, okay, with the money we're getting from the state, I might be able to afford the private school. But as we see, that's just not a very big number. So what happens to the public schools? Well, as I like to say, gold coins don't come out of the rear ends of unicorns. All those voucher checks that are now going to the rich people who could already afford those private schools are coming from a pot of money that was supposed to go to public things, like schools. That means there's less money and less resources to teachers and kids at public schools. First off, this is really bad news for small towns. If you've never heard of the term economy of scale, it basically means this. When you have a big expense, like say a school building, it works because there's enough money coming in to keep the lights on, run the air conditioners, have a principal, and operate the cafeteria. In a small town, schools can't operate because while there aren't a lot of students, all the money goes to that one thing. But if even a few people in a small town take their kids, and therefore their money, out of public schools, it really hurts the ability of a small town to have one. The governor of Texas has been pushing super hard for a voucher program for years. And this year, it looks like he has a good shot of getting the program through the legislature. But you know who has been repeatedly been some of the biggest opposition groups to this? Rural Republicans, because small school districts rely more on state funding than ones in bigger areas because of the less population. Taking money from them to fund some more homeschools or private schools that are a long way away really hurts their ability to keep the lights on. And then they have to eliminate things like extracurricular programs like band and sports just to stay functioning. Another group that is really hurt by vouchers is special ed kids. See, if a kid has a disability, public schools are required to take them because we want all of our kids to have a shot of making it in the world. But private schools can choose not to, and many of them don't want to have a kid with a wheelchair or a hearing disability or with autism because it costs more money. So if they say no, families with these kids don't really get a choice and then are left with sending their kid to public schools, which, as we just heard about, have less money for these resources than they would have had without vouchers. The funny thing about all of this, vouchers aren't really all that popular. While people, as we talked about, generally are okay with, hey, I want to send my kid to whatever public school I want, have some charter school options or whatever, vouchers have actually died in terms of state elections in states like Nebraska, Kentucky, and Colorado last year. In two of those states, Nebraska, where it died 60-40, and Kentucky, where literally every single county voted against them, are pretty conservative. And this is backed up by a recent national poll showing that 82% of Democrats and 58% of Republicans actually chose to have more money go to public schools than support a voucher program, which jives pretty closely with the election results we just saw. So if people generally want public schools funded and are leery about these voucher schemes, why are more states going in that direction? The answer, unfortunately, is pretty simple, and that's because a few billionaires with very conservative beliefs are putting a ton of money into funding voucher efforts and politicians who then support them. For instance, this one in Texas is being backed by a couple of wealthy oil guys from the west part of the state who are extremely religious, hence the support for public school dollars going to Christian schools, and that also helps to fund the Heritage Foundation. The Heritage Foundation wrote Project 2025 that Trump is basically putting into place at the federal level, which wants to get rid of the National Department of Education and all the funding that comes from there and promote vouchers at the state level based on the Arizona model, which are great for rich people and for religious schools, but are really killing state budgets. So what can you do if this stuff worries you? Well, if you're in a state like Texas right now, make sure you make your voice heard with your local representative and senator about your feelings for this issue. If you're in another state, you could have some right-wing billionaires with a religious agenda try this in your state. Make sure you stay on top of what state proposals are out there for state ballot measures and support pro-education candidates for the state legislature. And please, please, please pay attention to elections for local school boards. A lot of times these go under the radar, but folks in these positions make hugely important decisions and choices for the future of public schools. Thanks for listening to this. Again, this is What the Bleep Does This Mean? I'm Bill McCamley. If you have questions or comments, I'd love to hear them on any of the social media accounts you might be finding this on, or you can email whatthebleepdoesthismean@gmail.com. That's whatthebleepdoesthismean@gmail.com. Thanks everybody again for listening to this. Have a great day and good luck out there.